Okay, we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order then. Can we have a roll call? Daniel or Laura, whoever's going to do that, please.
I can do that. Roll call, Director Cody.
Present.
Director Gibson.
Here.
Director Zimmer.
Here.
Chairperson Ohilski.
Present.
Great, we have a quorum.
Okay, do we have any brief comments on that anybody on the board would like to communicate right now? Non-agenda items.
Marshall, this is Mark. I'd like to just make a comment and recognize the fact that we have recycled water delivery at the median on Los Osos Valley Road and Golden State's first recycled water connection. You know, it's just a milestone that's worth mentioning amongst this group here, and a significant step towards what we've been working on for many years in Los Osos. So I know county was highly involved in it, Celebrate Los Osos, the district, and Golden State. So really, and the community overall. So just wanted to take a minute to recognize that and celebrate a victory for our community.
Yeah, likewise, Marshall, if I could add my thanks to Golden State and everybody who worked on that. Celebrate Los Osos did a great job mobilizing a huge number of people. I was out there on the morning shift with like 40 other people doing some planting, and apparently another 30 or 40 showed up in the afternoon, and something cool got done. And yeah, thanks for the recycled water. It's going to work well.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, anybody else have a comment? All right, seeing none, we don't have any special presentation, so we'll move down to the consent agenda. And on the consent agenda, there's 3 items. A is approval of minutes from September 29th, 2021 BMC meeting. B is the 2021 budget update and invoice register. And C is the resolution authorizing continued remote teleconferencing basin management committee meetings. Does anybody want to pull an item? Okay, seeing none, does anybody have any comments before I go to public comment?
Marshall, I just make a comment on the resolution authorizing continued remote teleconferencing.
Yep.
I think, you know, we're still within our 30-day window of the last meeting. We may not need that for this meeting, but moving forward, I believe we have to do it at the very beginning of the meetings before they get started. So I just wanted to make that comment. At least that's what I'm seeing out there, and maybe Supervisor Gibson or some of the others that participate in more public meetings might know that for sure.
Well, my understanding is that you do that in the meeting. It doesn't have to be at the beginning. So I don't know if anybody else, because I'm on a number of public boards.
I don't know, maybe what we need to do is get down to the item that appoints our own counsel and get our own advice. I've heard a couple of different things, but my understanding of the reso that we would pass this time would be good extending into the future, that we're covered under the reso we passed last time. And there's some, I guess, question as to whether it exactly has to be 30 days or till the next scheduled meeting or something like that. But, you know, I think whatever we need to do to keep it going while we've got the COVID, I'm supportive if we can get a legal opinion on that.
Yeah, Bruce, and the state thing says 30 days or the next meeting. So
yeah, so I think to me what we're passing today is good till we meet next.
right. So anyways, we'll find out the answer to your question. Okay, Mark.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, any other questions, comments before I go to public comment? Okay, Laura, let's go to public comment on item 5.
If you'd like to make a public comment and you're on your phone, please dial *9. And if you're on your computer, please raise your hand. All right, Keith, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, and good afternoon, BMC members. Just a brief comment on the minutes and the question of whether transcripts should be provided. Last meeting, Dan indicated that staff had reviewed the issue and considered transcripts to be too expensive. I'm requesting that it is brought before the directors and voted on. The minutes are key to the public's understanding of the issues and to informed decision-making. I bet even BMC members would like to be able to review what was said at a meeting without having to search for it in an audio recording. Thanks.
Thank you, Keith. Any other public comment on item 5?
Yes, Lindy, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Good afternoon. This is Lindy Dowd. I agree with Keith regarding the meeting minutes. I don't believe we've yet come to a satisfactory solution. For the County Board of Supervisors, minutes that record actions only make sense, as their deliberations result in many actions regarding a range of topics at each meeting. But these BMC meetings, on the other hand, are focused on monitoring and managing one thing only, our groundwater basin. Action items are few, but the discussions surrounding them are substantial, detailed, and significant. The directors and the public alike provide valuable input into how to best utilize and protect this common resource, more like a think tank. Action minutes alone can't even begin to account for this, and the audio recordings, although necessary, are really unwieldy to slog through. Written transcriptions are a practical and valuable adjunct to the recordings. At the July meeting, this was discussed, and the outcome was that Chair Ohilsky said that we'd have an agendized item regarding providing physical transcripts of the meetings and the associated costs for discussion at the next meeting. But the next meeting in September did not have this subject on the agenda. So Keith Weimer inquired about it during public comment. Executive Director Heimel answered that it was discussed at a staff level following the July meeting, and that there was not staff level support for the cost that would be associated with developing full transcripts for the meetings. The costs were not brought to the BMC, nor was there any discussion by the BMC. I don't believe it was up to staff to review and nix it without the input of the BMC directors. And I hope the directors will see the relevance of this and will request that it be put on next month's agenda for director review and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindy.
All right, Lindy Owen, you just have to unmute yourself.
Hey, I, for some reason, can't get my face up there, but can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Look, this is, we're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to manage our basin. And please tell us what you estimate the cost would be to do the transcript, possibly farm it out to Lindy Dowd, who does an excellent job. This is all important record stuff. If people from the public would like to check in, they can read the minutes very quickly instead of spending 2.5 hours sitting through a meeting trying to comprehend. I urge you to please let a full set of minutes. The transcripts are better than we had before, and you have an option here to serve the public that is trying to understand what goes on with our basin. There is no better way for them to have input and oversight as to what goes on than to have these full transcripts. And I completely support them. And I thank Lindy for all the work she's put in the past, putting them together, or whoever has put them together. I think it's Lindy. So I support that we definitely put that back on the agenda. Let's talk about this and find out what that cost is. Don't just, say it's too expensive. Everything is too expensive. Thank you.
There's no further public comment at this time.
Okay, thank you. I think we can't obviously talk about that stuff that was raised about the minutes because it's not on our agenda, but We can agendize that for the next meeting. So why don't we go ahead and add that to our agenda for the next meeting, Dan, unless somebody has an objection to that.
I guess the question is why, we've pretty much settled it, Marshall. We'd indicated that for efficiency and cost effectiveness, the action minutes were fine. The recording is the official record of this meeting. Transcripts are costly. I think we have better things to talk about than whether to spend money on that. I'm happy with the status quo.
Yeah, but I think he can communicate the cost rather than having that decision made at the staff level.
I agree, Marshall, with your estimation. I think we should agendize that for an open public discussion. This is Charlie, by the way, at S&T.
Yeah. Okay, can we go ahead and have a motion then on the consent agenda?
Move approval.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor? Oh, wait,
Aye.
we have a resolution. We got to take a roll call vote. I'm sorry.
Yeah, roll call. Director Cody,
Yes,
Director Gibson,
Yes.
Director Zimmer,
Yes,
Chair O'Hilsky.
Yes,
Okay, vote passes 4-0.
okay. So now the next item is, item number 6 for public comment on items not appearing on the agenda. And I would like to make sure the public can, stays within the boundaries of that. So you can't talk, like 2.5 minutes over something that's on our agenda and then just throw something in at the beginning and the end that says it's not, because we do have a substantive item on the agenda that's going to take quite a while. So I've got to try to stay within the rules here. Okay, Laura, so let's go ahead and move forward with that.
If you'd like to make a public comment and you're on your phone, *9. If you're on your computer, please raise your hand. All right, Keith, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Keith Weimer. The LOSG recently received some documents from the county through a records request that suggests the basin may be facing a serious threat from a class of chemicals referred to by the acronym PFAS. These chemicals cause cancer and other serious health problems. They are referred to as forever chemicals because they don't break down in the environment or in the body. The information we received from the county, which we understand the purveyors received also, indicates that the regional board has designated the Los Osos Recycled Water Facility as a receiver of PFAS via the influent and as a source of PFAS via the effluent or recycled water that leaves the facility. The regional board apparently required the county to test several wells downhill from the Broderson leach field site and Bay Ridge Estates leach fields, where recycled water is being discharged. In both instances, PFAS was found at notification levels, and results indicate that the wells may have concentrations at response levels, which can mean that owners of wells have to shut them down or take other remedial actions. Fortunately, PFAS chemicals can apparently be reduced to non-detectable levels by reverse osmosis and possibly by filtration, and they can be addressed by blending water sources. I know the schedule is full today, but the public should hear about this issue and how you will address it. So the LSJ is requesting a BMC presentation on the topic in the near future. Our limited review of articles and documents indicates that state regulation of these chemicals will get tougher in the next year or so. And some communities have already begun to shut down supply wells and to scramble for funding to offset the costs of cleanup. We strongly urge the BMC, the county, and purveyors to get out in front of this, test all the wells, and plan and pursue remedies. Assess and factor this threat into grant funding considerations. We don't want to find out that the BMC or purveyors have to wait several years for grant funding because action wasn't taken soon enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith.
All right, Jeff, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, committee members. My name is Jeff Edwards, and I wanted to touch on several items. The first of which is the recently released Cleith Harris geologist's tech memo on the subject of nitrate source investigation at Sunset Terrace Mutual Water Company, Lower Aquifer. And this tech memo, again, it's dated September 24th. And I wanted to touch on a handful of highlights because this is another example of Sunset Terrace, the Mutual Water Company crying wolf. And this tech memo purportedly is trying to source the cause of what's considered increasing nitrates in their well that serves their neighborhood. And in the report, it states that the current level of nitrate is 7.4 mgl, milligrams per liter. And the Cleith Harris geologist prediction is that in 20 years, the drinking water threshold of 10 mgl may be exceeded. 20 years. And so just for a couple of comparisons, the Upper Aquifer data that we have in the annual report shows that it's down from 22 mgl to 20 mgl. Also, the treated wastewater coming out of the sewer plant is anywhere from 2 to 5 mgl. So I got to wonder what they really want. It appears they want to take this data, which, by the way, the conclusion of the report says Cabrillo Estate's the cause. That's what the report says. Well, I have to take issue with that because there are a number of other potential contributing sources that may contribute as much or more. And their purpose, I think, is to take this information, go to the water board, and try to leverage them to order Cabrillo Estates to put in a sanitary sewer system. Well, that's almost laughable if you look at the details. By the way, in the Cleith Harris geologist report, they state that S&T has 591 customers. Well, just to be clear, they have 175 to 180 connections. That's all they have. And then the tech memo also fails to even talk about the local agency management plan, which is tailored specifically for septic systems, and Cabrillo Estates is very much part of that. So I'm kind of over S&T crying wolf and looking for somebody else to pay for their problems. It's unfortunate that they're a member of this committee because they're not looking out for the entire basin. They're looking out for S&T. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right, Lindy Dowd, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Good afternoon. This is Lindy Dowd again. Thank you for this opportunity to comment. Last meeting, Chair O'Hilsky asked Director Gibson to explain why existing ag wells are not required to be metered because, as he said, the issue keeps coming up. It keeps coming up for good reason when an estimated half of the water extracted from our basin is unmetered. Mr. Gibson's answer circled around it, stating that it would be a huge, complicated effort requiring lots of discussion and a county ordinance. He believed the estimates have been serving us reasonably well, and he asserted that legal entanglements and fees would be involved. You gentlemen are far more well-versed in the basin plan details than I am, but I'd like to highlight section 7.5.2 of the basin plan, which states that, quote, the Basin Management Committee and parties will face a significant challenge to successful management of the basin without the collection and use of data from non-purveyors. In particular, with over 40% of the basin production based on estimates, the Basin Management Committee and parties may not be able to accurately predict or measure the effect of their actions to stop seawater intrusion using the basin yield metric and other metrics. Because there is a substantial time lag between potential over extractions from the basin as calculated through the basin yield metric and measurement of actual impacts on the basin in the water level metric and chloride metric, any errors resulting from use of estimated rather than actual production figures will not be known for as long as 15 years, when it will be too late to correct. It is vitally important for the basin yield metric to be as accurate as possible in order to ensure that the proper actions are being taken to stop seawater intrusion as early as possible, unquote. It goes on to describe the two ways in which non-purveyor producers of groundwater from the basin could measure and report their annual groundwater production. One, voluntary, as Mr. Cody suggested, and the other via well registration through a county ordinance. 6 years into the management of this basin by this committee, I believe that there is mounting evidence that estimates of non-metered well production have not been serving us well. And I urge you to put this on the agenda and seriously talk about it. Thank you.
All right, Larry, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I'm Larry Rayo. Recently Ron Munns was authorized by the LOCSD to look for outside sources of water. And I think that's prudent to do that. But I also, in his article that was written in the New Times, it really made the basin look like it was in pretty sad shape. And I just hope that you guys continue to do all your efforts and don't get sidetracked from, looking for new water, which I think is going to be difficult to find good quality water, and do what needs to be done to protect our basin. I think our basin can be protected, but it's just going to take some hard measurements, and maybe making some decisions that aren't going to look so good as far as the basin yield metric goes in order to turn this thing around. So I just want you guys to do the best you can to protect our basin and not rely on outside water, because I'm not sure if he's going to be able to find any or not. Thank you.
All right, Lindy, you just have to unmute yourself.
Hi again, Lindy Owen. I first want to speak about the nitrate proliferation that is appearing underneath the Cabrillo Estates, the horse farms, which are the largest nitrate producer that we know, and the golf course with their fertilizers and et cetera that keep that green. If that's where the nitrates are getting high readings, it's pretty obvious that there is a part of our community that is not contributing to nitrate removal. And it is time to have a conversation with regional board to point out that those three sources are likely in need of being addressed, or we put in an entire sewer so that we could handle nitrates, and to eliminate an area that has high nitrates continuing to go into the basin is irresponsible. And so I really urge that we have that conversation about where we can go to get those areas. And they don't have to put their own sewer plant in, they just have to hook up. This is not rocket science. Again, with the private wells, as far as I can understand, the private property owners that are using well water contribute not one penny to balancing our basin. And I would like to know what the cost of putting measuring devices on their wells and getting the reading done, and whether it's shared by the basin costs to do this, or if it comes as a request that they pay the cost of having that done. It needs to be addressed. They don't worry about water. The rest of us are worrying about water. The very idea that we are going to possibly need to import water is not a place we should be going. We need to protect what we have and be living within our means. That water that we might be able to hook up to someday after spending 10 million for a connector line is getting more and more polluted. It's less high, the quality is going down. That is a known. As far as new growth goes, again, we shouldn't be putting new growth in as long as we still have an issue. As long as we still have an issue of discussing about importing water. Come on. We have enough to continue with what we've got, and we need to be extremely careful. And I want the county to take some responsibility. They are in charge of all the private wells. They need to step up and contribute. We ratepayers are paying the cost to clean a basin that other people don't pay a penny for. So I urge you to let's figure out who can contribute to protecting the basin further. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindy.
All right, Patrick, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Patrick McGibney, the Los Osos Sustainability Group. I too would like to comment on Director Gibson's response to the question Mr. Olhilsky asked him last meeting on why existing ag wells are not required to be metered. Mr. Gibson's response was a dodge, and his comments made little sense. This is what the basin plan says, and I quote, "Because all residents, businesses, and institutions in Los Osos benefit from a sustainable basin, it is appropriate that all contribute to a responsible management of the basin, including this groundwater monitoring program." The quote goes on, but you should all be familiar with it by this time. Mr. Gibson asserted, "If you want to go measure each and every one of the existing ag wells, there's a huge effort that needs to be undertaken." Well, I ask, what is that huge effort you speak of, and why hasn't it been made already? He then said, "Do you really want to open up the possibility that each and every one of these parties out on the east side of the basin want to become parties to the stipulated judgment in the adjudication?" Mr. Cody correctly responded by saying, "We wouldn't be asking them to become parties to a stipulated judgment." But then Mr. Gibson continues, "And so what it was decided is, so as not to complicate the process and not to impose the burden of legal fees on all those small property owners to the east," and he goes on, "there are no legal fees or burdens to these properties. And the property owners to the east are not small property owners, but big ag properties. The basin plan says, quote, the cost of implementing such a county ordinance is expected to be approximately $150,000, including the purchase and installation of meters on all private, domestic, and agricultural wells in the basin. Costs associated with procuring and installing meters would be paid for as part of this groundwater monitoring program to be funded as described in Chapter 15, end of quote. Now, I apologize if I misinterpreted your comment, Mr. Gibson, and please correct me if I am wrong with this. But during another BMC meeting, I believe you were asked, since you're not a purveyor to the basin, what role have you and do you play on the BMC? And I believe you stated your response being that you are representative of the ag properties. If so, I see this as a major obstacle to upholding the basin plan and a conflict in the sustainable basin. My issue isn't with just Mr. Gibson's response, it's also with a lack of response from the majority of the BMC staff. All wells over our basin need to be metered, and I agree with Ms. Dowd. Put this on the agenda and let's talk about it. Thank you.
There's no other public comment at this time.
Thank you, Laura. I'd just like to talk a little briefly about this metering the ag wells thing, because there's a lot of historic knowledge here that's missing. The BMC has in the past passed motions to ask the county to meter all wells. That's something that's already been addressed multiple times. I have to point out for people's, to make sure people understand this, that neither the Basin Management Committee nor the CSD nor any other entity has land use authority in the basin. The county is the only one that has land use authority. These decisions are made by the county since they have sole authority to make land use decision. And I would point out one other thing for an example of what we can do. regarding ADUs in the community, which was discussed multiple times. The purveyors did send a letter to the Coastal Commission, since they're the purveyors of water, talking about why the ADUs were problematic for the basin. So things do get addressed, but I have to point out again that the county has land use authority, not the Basin Management Committee. So does anybody else have anything to say at this point? Okay, let's move on then, Laura. At this point, I'm going to change the agenda because I think that item number 8A is going to take quite a long time. So I'm going to move this executive director's report, since it's not action items, to the end of the agenda. And if we have time, we'll do this. If we don't have time, we'll basically kick this over to next month's meeting. So with that being said, let's move on to item 8A,
Excuse me,
please.
Marshall, do we want to give Daniel a chance to perhaps answer some of the other questions asked by the public?
Yeah, I don't know what other ones there were, but yeah, Daniel, if you want to.
Sure. I
Sorry,
mean,
I was focused on that land use authority issue. My apologies.
yeah, I mean, a number of these comments were directed at individual BMC parties or other entities. So I won't respond necessarily to those, but just from a BMC perspective, metering of ag wells is an initiative that was included in the implementation plan. It was, up for discussion when we developed the calendar year 2021 budget. It's another item that can be up for discussion for prioritization for the calendar year 2022 budget. But unfortunately, the Basin Management Committee has limited staff and or resources and has to prioritize what initiatives it budgets and plans for in the upcoming years, but will be part of the dialogue. Yeah, I think that's
Daniel,
really
let me point out, I mean, you haven't been with the committee that are with represented us, but in prior years before you joined, we did pass motions multiple times to request metering of the wells.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. That's good knowledge to have, Marshall. I guess the other one I would comment on is the item about PFAS. PFAS is a very significant concern, not just for the community of Los Osos, but for water utilities across the state and likely around the world. And so improving an understanding of the sources of PFAS, I would think is a good idea and something that should be investigated. But
that's it.
That's it.
Okay. All right, let's move on to item 8A, which is the sustainable yield methodology review and recommendations. So I assume, Daniel, that's in your lap?
Yes. Hold on, we're going to change the screen sharing here.
You should be able to share. Let me know if you're having issues.
All right, is that coming through?
Yep.
Great. So yeah, item 8A, sustainable yield methodology review and recommendations. I just want to start off with the recommendation here that the BMC staff, working closely with BMC party staff and other stakeholders, has spent a lot of time evaluating and coming up with estimates for the sustainable yield for calendar year 2022. And so BMC staff today is bringing forth a recommendation for the BMC to receive information on the updated sustainable yield calculation and to approve a proposed sustainable yield estimate of 2,380 acre feet per year for calendar year 2022, or provide alternate direction to staff. And I'll move into the background here. So the BMC is required to annually evaluate, confirm, and set the sustainable yield. And the BMC embarked on that process for calendar year 2022 in July, when the BMC directed BMC staff to review the sustainable yield methodology and assumptions and bring back recommendations for the BMC to consider. At its September 29th meeting, the BMC received those recommendations and directed staff to calculate sustainable yield estimates for calendar year 2022 using the previously approved and proposed alternative thresholds for seawater intrusion definitions and updated rainfall estimates, and to bring those alternatives calculations back to the BMC for their consideration. And so that's what the BMC staff is bringing forth to the BMC today. As requested by the BMC at the September meeting, BMC staff is bringing back a number of different alternative sustainable yield estimates for the BMC's consideration. And these different sustainable yield estimates are based on a number of different key methodologies and or assumptions that are utilized within the modeling scenarios that are used to calculate the sustainable yield for the basin. And so what I'm showing here is a summary table of the 4 sustainable yield estimate scenarios that the BMC staff is bringing back to the BMC for their consideration. And I'll just walk through the different key assumptions here. First, we have scenario numbering on the side. That's just to help us differentiate between the different scenarios for the purposes of this discussion. But the first key variable is the assumption with respect to what is the seawater intrusion front is allowed to do during the calculation of the sustainable yield. And there's really 2 options that the BMC staff evaluated. One, what we're calling the historic method, where the seawater intrusion front was allowed to intrude further inland than it is today before stabilizing during the calculation of the sustainable yield estimate. And then scenarios 2 through 4 incorporate what we call the adaptive method seawater intrusion threshold, which limits the ability of the seawater intrusion front to go no further into the basin than we have observed today during the calculation of the sustainable yield estimates. The second variable is rainfall. And in all 4 scenarios, the proposed assumption for rainfall is 17.3 inches per year. This represents a long-term average rainfall for the Los Osos Basin, and we believe is appropriate for the use in a steady state model. The next assumption is the Broderson Mound, and so this is an assumption that helps us better assess current conditions within the basin. Previous estimates of sustainable yield from the basin assumed a Broderson Mound that was 100% developed. But the BMC knows, and those that have been participating in BMC meetings, that the development of the Broderson Mound is going to take time. And it is not assumed to be fully developed at this point. In fact, it's only assumed to be, or estimated to be, 50% developed based on water level information that we have. And so in the calculation of the sustainable yield estimates, we included a number of different assumptions for the level of development of the Broderson Mound. 100% developed, which had been used previously, and then ranging down to 50% developed, which we believe represents the actual current state of the development of the Broderson Mound. The next criteria is available infrastructure. In calculating the sustainable yield, there are assumptions that need to be made on the infrastructure that is available within that calendar year. And so the assumption that was included in these scenarios and the results associated with this was available infrastructure that infrastructure that would be available in 2022, or infrastructure that infrastructure that's available now, or that will be available in early 2022 or Q1 of 2022, specifically in reference to the Los Osos CSD Upper 8th Street well, which has been bid and is anticipated to be completing construction and running in early 2022. So for each of these scenarios, there is a sustainable yield value calculated for them, ranging from 2,650 acre feet per year down to 2,380 acre feet per year. Provided in the next column is a corresponding basin yield metric for those sustainable yield estimates. And this is developed based on an assumed production of 2,010 acre feet per year, which is a production that was estimated in the 2020 annual report. Again, for reference, the basin yield metric is the ratio of estimated production in the basin to the estimated sustainable yield for the basin at that time. And then finally, in the last column, we have the associated target production from the basin yield metric. So in the basin plan, and the basin yield metric establishes a ratio of 0.8 as the target for the basin yield metric. And so you can calculate an associated production target by applying that ratio to the sustainable yield. And so that's what's shown in the fourth column there, is the associated production target for each of the sustainable yield estimates. What I additionally provided on this slide is just another row that compares these sustainable yield estimates to the sustainable yield estimate that was prepared in 2017. And I just for comparison purposes, so people can see what were the assumptions included in the last sustainable yield estimate and what is being proposed in the updated sustainable yield estimate today. Additionally provided are figures from the model that show the anticipated location of the seawater intrusion front under the two of the different sustainable yield estimate scenarios. And so we picked these two scenarios because they bookend the anticipated conditions within the basin. And so we're going to show figures for scenario 1 and figures for scenario 4. So in this slide, we are showing the estimated location of the seawater intrusion front from scenario 1. And just for reference, scenario 1 utilizes the historic method definition for seawater intrusion, or allows seawater intrusion to intrude past the current extents within the basin. And this is illustrated by the dashed green line and the dashed orange line, which represent current extents of seawater intrusion. And what you can see is under this sustainable yield scenario, that seawater intrusion front is allowed to extend past those extents before stabilizing when calculating the sustainable yield estimate for this scenario. The other assumption that's included in this scenario is Broderson Mound is modeled as 100% development. And the corresponding sustainable yield, as was shown on the previous slide for scenario 1, is 2,650 with a basin yield metric 80 target of 2,120 acre feet per year. Conversely, the scenario 4 results are shown on this slide. Scenario 4, the primary differences between scenario 1 and scenario 4 are: 1, scenario 4 utilizes the adaptive method seawater intrusion threshold limitation, and that's shown in the figure here. As you can see, the anticipated location of the seawater intrusion front, represented by the solid green and orange lines, does not exceed the historic extents of seawater intrusion as illustrated by the green and orange dashed lines. And then the other assumption built in here is a Broderson Mound that's developed only to 50% of its anticipated size, and so that additionally lowers the sustainable yield estimate for this scenario. Again, as shown on the previous table, the sustainable yield estimate for this scenario is 2,380 acre feet per year, with a basin yield metric target of 1,904 acre feet per year. Additionally, shown on the figure and not mentioned on the previous slide is these smaller dashed lines. And so these are the lines that represent the anticipated location of the seawater intrusion front in zones D and E when the basin or production within the basin is at the target, the BYM 80 target level. So in this case, that's 1,904. And what it can be noted here is that the model predicts that when production is at the target, the basin will be able to push the seawater intrusion front back towards the bay and away from the developed portions of the basin. And so, kind of in summary, based on the review of these results, the BMC staff recommends that the BMC approve the proposed sustainable yield estimate of 2,380 acre-feet per year for California for calendar year 2022, based on the following findings. First, it incorporates the adaptive method threshold. In other words, it includes an assumption that doesn't allow seawater intrusion to get any worse than it is today, and establishes a minimum threshold that doesn't allow seawater intrusion to intrude further, and then has an associated basin yield metric 80 target that pushes seawater intrusion back out towards the bay. Two, the Broderson Mound assumption. This scenario assumes an assumption that the Broderson Mound is only 50% developed, which is our current estimate of the level of the development of the Broderson Mound. And thus this scenario much more closely models current conditions within the basin and provides a more accurate picture of the amount of water that could be sustainably pumped under current conditions than scenarios that incorporate a 100% developed Broderson Mound. Third, available infrastructure. This is consistent with all the scenarios, but the calculation of the sustainable yield 2022 accounts for currently available infrastructure and infrastructure anticipated to be available for the majority of 2022 or available in early 2022. And then fourth, the precipitation assumption. The 17.3 inches, which was the methodology for developing that assumption, was presented at the last meeting. This represents a long-term average precipitation for the Los Osos Basin and is appropriate for utilization as an assumption for rainfall in a steady state sustainable yield calculation. Additionally, if the BMC is in agreement with staff's recommendation and the proposed methodology, staff proposes that the BMC apply the same methodology for calculating the calendar year 2021 sustainable yield estimate for incorporation into the 2021 annual report, as the proposed sustainable yield estimate methodology in this staff report varies significantly from in terms of the key assumptions from the previously developed sustainable yield estimate of 2,760. I would point out here, though, that this is not an action that the BMC would need to take today. We don't have estimates of a calendar year 2021 sustainable yield number using the proposed methodology, but something for the BMC to consider before the production of the 2021 annual report, which we will have anticipate a draft available to the BMC in March or April of 2022. And so that concludes the presentation on item 8A.
Thank you, Daniel. So let's go to questions from the commissioners before we go to public comment. Daniel, I have one question. One of the things that I understand is included in here is the use of recycled water to all of the school sites in Los Osos. But then I also understand that it might just be going to the middle school, in which case there's a significant change in the amount of water being used at the school sites. Have you confirmed this with the county or anybody there, so we know what they're actually planning on doing with the school sites?
Yes, 2 points there. One, the included in these estimates is not recycled water to the school sites. These estimates incorporate available infrastructure in 2022, and currently those school sites aren't connected, or we didn't anticipate that they would be connected in early 2022. So those recycled water deliveries aren't incorporated in the numbers presented here today. However, it is my understanding, and it's discussed in the executive director's report, that the county has allocated ARPA funds, American Recovery and Protection Act, I believe, for the future connection of the schools within the Los Osos community to the recycled water program, and has sufficient funds budgeted to connect all 3 schools within the ARPA funds, but that would be prioritizing the connection of the Los Osos Middle School first, as it is the largest water user of the 3 primary schools.
Thank you for that. So do we have some other questions from?
Yeah, if I could, Marshall, it's Bruce. Dan, just a question on this last point on the slide and calculating the calendar year 21 sustainable yield for the annual monitoring report. It would really be a revision of the 21. I mean, I'm trying to get the timing of this. We, I thought the idea was that we would set a sustainable yield, modify it when appropriate. And I've got some thoughts once we get to deliberations on, we should really set a policy on under what circumstances we modify it, but that's a forward-looking thing. And I guess the calendar year 21 sustainable yield, what would we change? I mean, what would be the things that would change in that backward looking? We're almost done with 21. What does it serve us to go backward on the sustainable yield when we're reporting on results of a previous year when we approved the 21 report in 2022?
Yeah, so the thought here, Director Gibson, was that the sustainable yield that we're discussing today, as specified in the stipulated judgment, is for the upcoming year, and so it's for calendar year 2022, and would be incorporated in the basin yield metric calculation, the basin development metric calculation, the purveyor pool calculations for calendar year 2022.
Okay.
The intent of this recommendation here is that it's just because of the timing. And so while we can approve something for 2022, and we can describe it in the 2021 annual report, which we will begin developing in a couple of months, there would be a disconnect in the 2020. It wouldn't actually kick in until
22
year in 2022, and wouldn't show up in the basin yield metric until the 2022 annual report.
Right.
So I guess based on my understanding, the last approved sustainable yield estimate for the purposes of calculating the basin yield metric in the 2021 annual report is 2,760, and so it and that's fine. That follows the the sequence outline, but it's gonna potentially just make for a delayed implementation of this new methodology, and may lead to confusion, because actions taken today by the Basin Management Committee to potentially change some of the key methodology and key assumptions wouldn't necessarily get translated into an annual report or the presentation.
It could, for instance, make the basin yield metric look artificially low. Since if we adopt this, we'd say, hey, in 21, we understood that the basin yield might be less than 27. Here's the number we adopted. So I mean, I guess it would make sense to me. Yeah, okay, I understand where you're going with it. I just think it needs to be very, very carefully explained and a consistent approach. Let's not confuse the old, if we choose to adopt this, let's not confuse the old 2,700 and some number with this one, because we're trying to, in the 21 report, we're trying to characterize the state of the basin and the state of management as of, let's say, the end of 2021, preparatory to getting into 22, right?
Correct. Okay. Yeah, and so we can't I don't believe take action on this because we don't have it. So I mean,
Right.
it's also something maybe we could punt until we get through the 2022 estimate, which is a little more clear.
Yeah, I think it sounds like direction to staff to consider that when we prepare the report, really is what we're talking about.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, if I could just add to that last bullet point, we need to clarify that and memorialize it. I think, in line with Supervisor Gibson, our intent was not to move backwards, but to move forward. I think maybe would we be able to resolve this by memorializing it in our annual report, the upcoming annual report, and then in that statement, however it's decided to make that statement, we just come to a consensus that the new sustainable yield will be utilized in 2022 for decision-making purposes.
Right.
Because as we move forward, we're really not going to see it in our annual report till 2023. So if there's a way we can memorialize it and move forward in using these numbers without going back and making some type of revision to our 2021 actions, that would be in line with what my thought was, how we were going to move forward in handling this.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Charlie, do you have anything to add at this point?
Something happened with Charlie's audio. He's in the process of logging back on.
Okay. Well, let's go to public comment then.
Sorry, I had myself muted. If you would like to make a public comment and you're on your phone, please dial *9. And if you're on your computer, please raise your hand. All right,
wait,
Jeff, you just have to
wait.
unmute yourself.
Well, and Jeff, could you hold on a minute, please? I think Charlie's back on here.
Sure.
Sorry, Jeff, 1 second.
Charlie, can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm dialing in and I'm rebooting my computer, so hopefully I have my notes available soon also.
Okay. So did you have any questions before we went to public comment? Because I had already started it while you were gone, but if you had a question.
No, I don't.
Okay, all right, let's go back to Jeff and start his time over.
All right, Jeff, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Jeff Edwards speaking. I have 4 takeaways from what I've heard today and read in the staff report. The first takeaway is that this has become Broderson centric. That is the mounding at Broderson. And I'd kind of like to understand how we're going to sync up the management of the basin and the operation of the wastewater recycling facility, which sends water to Broderson, as you know. They haven't been synced up. How are we going to ensure that? Also, there appears to be a difference, and this is hard to glean, but the difference between 50% mounding and 100% appears to be equivalent to 130 acre feet. How are we going to know when we get to 100% is my question. I'm not sure we know we're at 50 actually. I understand that there are transducers in hand, and we need to deploy those transducers to fully understand the effects of Broderson. I have trouble putting all our eggs in that basket, frankly. The second takeaway is that the Los Osos community plan at this juncture with these numbers is dead on arrival. This is not a favorable situation as compared to the 2,760 acre feet, clearly. The third takeaway is that it's absolutely essential now that we proceed with the Program C number 3 well. It's in the the ED report. Well, the Program C number 3 well may be deferred. Well, forget the deferment. It's absolutely essential. And then the fourth takeaway is that given this situation, if we're to believe all this, that it's absolutely necessary for Los Osos to acquire state project water. Those are the four takeaways. Now my questions. The math is very sketchy. So it's virtually impossible to follow the math on this whole operation. My other questions are really the 8th Street Upper Aquifer well. How much a yield are we attributing to that facility, that infrastructure, because that appears to be built in since it'll be operational next year. Then how much yield did we attribute to the program C #1 well on Los Olivos, the Golden State well? How much? What's the yield there? Then thirdly, what can we expect in terms of a yield from the program C #2 well that the LOCSD is producing? And then lastly, the idea of reversing the seawater intrusion, which I heard your executive director mention a couple times, that's dreamland. Let's focus on halting the advance of the seawater intrusion and forego this notion of reversing. I think that's ridiculous.
Your time's
Jeff,
up.
you've reached your
Thank
3
you.
minutes.
Gee, thank you.
All right, Deborah, you just have to unmute yourself.
Hi, yes, thank you very much, Deborah Howe. Daniel, thank you very much for your work on this. I'm looking at the summary table. I do have a little confusion, hoping you can clarify. What does 100% of the Broderson Mound, what does that represent? Does 100% mean that's as much as we can stuff in there? Or does it mean that at 100%, we're getting 100% of water flowing into the aquifer? Do you see my confusion? That's my
Deborah,
question.
he'll answer questions after public comments. Then, do you have any more to say?
That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Larry, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Larry Rayo here. Yeah, I think the numbers I'm looking at here, I think the development of the Broderson Mound, if I'm not mistaken, means that it's totally saturated top to bottom, and that's when it starts to actually function. And I think that even if we call it only 50% developed, that doesn't mean it's functioning at all. So I'm not sure, how your numbers are coming in there. The whole soil column needs to be saturated for the water to move, and it doesn't look like we're getting any effect in the lower aquifer wells as far as sea level rise. So I would say it's not functioning at all, even though the mound may be 50% developed. I also think that we're using best case scenarios of all of these numbers. I would like to be presented with the best case scenario and the worst case scenario, and then sort of choose something in between when we do it. Like for rainfall, for the Broderson Mound, for infrastructure, for private use wells, for ag use. We've written a letter, LOSG wrote a letter, saying how ag use is way overestimated. At 95% efficiency, let's get some best case and worst case scenarios and see where the numbers take us. I think you might be surprised how much lower the basin yield metric is going to be. And I know it's not something that you really want to look at, but the fact of the matter is the basin is not responding the way the model is suggesting. So some of the numbers have to be off. So let's, your available infrastructure, I was under the understanding when the 8th Street well went in that it was going to be prorated. I'm not sure if that number was prorated for this, but, let's put it in, make sure it's working, and then use the infrastructure. I don't know if we have to jump the gun so quickly just because it's something we think is going to be in and working, to use it in today's numbers, and the rainfall number, we're well below for the last 15 years. And I know it's a long-term range thing, but we have a 15-year deficit, and it would have to be up more to 20 inches if we want to just regain what we've already lost over the last 15 years. Anyway, That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
All right, Lindy, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Laura. Lindy Owen again. I completely agree with this idea that we need to look at a worst case scenario. I'm not happy to see 17.3 inches annual rainfall as the number. Let's look at 17 plus maybe 14 or 12, because we are in an unprecedented future with climate change and the differences in rainfall patterns that we used to see. And I do not like us going with the best case scenario, because we are needing caution, a lot of caution, I think. And again, Broderson, if Broderson doesn't work, how can we put such a importance on that actually getting into the lower aquifer? It may never happen. So I just, Broderson is, you're giving it way too much credit for being a workable deal. And besides the schools, possibly this was supposed to have happened years ago. And so here we are, we still haven't got them the recycled water. So we have, or the ag. So we have no exchange going on, which is the number one way to keep the water in the basin, is to use recycled water in those cases. And I asked before, is the cemetery currently using recycled water? I understand they're not. So could you please answer that question this time? Because if they're not using it, then you need to take them off of the list of places that you're disposing of it. And I didn't like that last comment about using, I don't quite understand, but using data from this year and putting it into next year's model. If that shows that we have more sustainable supply, I disagree. We need to be much more realistic about sustainability. This county is famous for producing paper water. That means water that we assume we're going to have. And I think it's time to stop that behavior. That's really irresponsible. And last but least, I'm forgetting. Well, I'll let it go. I'm forgetting one other point that was brought up by, I think, Larry. So, you know, those of us who have to live in this community for the rest of our lives, we're here to protect it, and we're going to be extra responsible, maybe more than the county wants to be. And so that's why you hear us participating. So thank you. Use caution. Bye.
Thank you, Lindy.
All right, Patrick, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Patrick McGibney, Los Osos Sustainability Group. I'd like to thank Dan and the BMC staff for their earnest efforts and hard work to make some needed changes. It's a step in the right direction, but a bigger step is needed. To the purveyors, we, your water customers, are more than willing to sacrifice to save our basin. Stricter conservation and measures are the only way we can bring our basin back to health and from the brink of permanent damage. The new sustainable yield numbers are not going to do it. It's still 370 acre feet over the current extraction rate, which still had seawater intrusion coming in. The safe yield has to be under that. With a 20% buffer, the basin yield metric at 2,380 would be 1,904. That's where the sustainable yield should be. Adjust the purveyor pools to match, and as your customers, we will do what is needed. The precipitation estimates need to be adjusted to a more realistic level also. 17.3 annually doesn't take into consideration we're entering into a historic drought. This last rain we had from the largest atmospheric river recorded dropped a little more than 2 inches of rain on most of Los Osos. We would need more than 7 additional atmospheric rivers to reach the estimate of 17 plus inches. We only have 6 months left in our rain season, which would mean we would need an atmospheric river more than once a month. Unfortunately, it's predicted to be another La Nina year. We do have rain totals in Los Osos for the last decade, which recorded less than 13 inches annually. That's the direction we're headed. Here's some interesting calculations on unmetered wells. In the September agenda packet, there was a table that showed Sea Pines Golf Course drawing an estimated 50 acre-feet yearly, plus it was receiving 30 acre-feet of recycled water. That would be 80 acre-feet annually being used to keep the ponds full and the courses green. 80 acre-feet equals 26 million gallons annually, or over 71,000 gallons per day. We're told that the average home in Los Osos uses 50 gallons per person per day. 71,000 gallons is equivalent to what over 1,400 residents use daily. With those kinds of unmetered uses, we have to conserve more. Thank you.
All right, Keith, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Keith Weimer. I also want to thank Dan and staff for working hard to come up with a realistic sustainable yield consistent with accepted definitions. Your efforts do make me feel much better about the basin's chance of survival. I think the proposal has a ways to go though, mainly because the 2380 acre-feet is not supported by data. For 6 years, basin-wide production has averaged a little under 2,100 acre-feet, and we've seen no evidence that seawater intrusion has significantly improved. In fact, it continues to move inland. Setting the sustainable yield at 280 acre-feet above the average production level adds an unjustified margin of yield that jeopardizes the future of the basin because it can be used to justify what may well be an unsustainable level of development and production. The assumptions or parameter values embedded in the 2380 acre-feet are also not supported by data. The influence of Broderson and leach fields on seawater intrusion is assumed to be 50%. However, there is no evidence that the leach fields are influencing seawater intrusion, and the timing and the amount of future influence is uncertain. Therefore, the parameter should be set at 0 until data supports otherwise. The assumption that expansion well number 1 at Los Olivos and the 8th Street well increase the sustainable yield is also not supported by data. And the 17.3 inches of rainfall, that parameter is not supported by data. 15 years of data from the Los Osos landfill is enough to set a more cautious rainfall level. I also want to remind BMC members that no matter what sustainable yield you agree on, it will have uncertainty and may not be low enough. This is because it is based on modeling, and modeling is a theoretical construct of reality based on limited data and many assumptions. This is why the LOSG urges you to upgrade the monitoring program and to base decisions that can have long-term and irreversible consequences, such as whether the basin can support further demand, on conclusive evidence in the form of clear, measurable, and protective objectives based on sufficient, high-quality monitoring data. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith.
There were 3 comments made through the question and answer, which I'm going to read real quick.
Wait,
The
just a
first
minute,
one
Laura.
is, oh.
Just a minute. No, I wanted to thank Patrick and Keith for their comments. My microphone muted and I didn't thank Patrick after his comments, so.
Perfect.
Now
All
you
right,
can
so
go to
the
yeah.
first one online, it says, question for Dan. What has been the record for annual rainfall for the past 10 years? How many recent years have we had 17 inches of rain recorded? If we are only getting 12 or 14 inches of rain each year, how would all the calculations for the future change using actual recent rainfall records that are expected by NOAA to be more representative of what we should expect in coming years? Along with many of my neighbors, I am worried if it is irresponsible to base basin sustainability on unrealistic rainfall figures. The next comment says, how does drought influence the rainfall needed of 17.3 inches? Is drought considered a steady state? And Judy West says, where are where are you going 17 inches a year? We are in a mega drought. This is wishful thinking. Where is your evidence? And there's no further public comment at this time. Marshall, you're muted.
I've been having trouble with this for the last few minutes. I was good the whole meeting, but up till now. Yeah, Daniel, would you like to go ahead and respond to the questions, please?
Yes, let me respond to some of those questions. So there was a question about how do we know the Broderson Mound is developing, and I think it was sort of answered in some of the additional public comment, but the Broderson Mound, we track its development, and by development, in response to Deborah Howe's question, is what the mound is an actual, ultimately, it's a mound of groundwater that has percolated from the Broderson leach field down to the aquitard that separates the upper aquifer and the lower aquifer. And so we are currently putting, and I'm just say rough numbers here, about 450 or 400 plus acre feet per year into the Broderson leach field. And over time, that is creating that mound. But that mound doesn't get created instantly. It takes time to fill up that portion of the basin. And even as you fill it up, the center of that mound, some of that water starts to run off to the sides. And so it's a transient development of this mound. And so when we say, how do we know how much that mound is developed, we estimate that based on groundwater levels that we can measure in that mound. And then we can compare those groundwater levels that are observed with the anticipated future groundwater levels once that mound is fully developed. And so when we talk about the development of the mound within the sustainable yield scenarios, the 100% development of the mound would assume that mound was fully developed and it reached what its anticipated maximum height is within the basin. But because it hasn't reached that point, not enough time has passed, we, based on observations of groundwater levels in the basin, we estimate that it's 50% developed. So it's only half as high as we anticipate it to be once it reaches its full development. And so hopefully that answers the questions of both what does that represent, and then how will we know it? We will monitor groundwater levels in and around the Broderson Mound, and to see the extent that they're raised. And certain evidence is that we've raised groundwater levels in one portion of the mound 12 feet to date, and that's the number that's used that was used to develop the estimate of 50% development. Other questions? I think that another question about the Broderson Mound. There's a question about range of numbers and also using conservative assumptions. And what the BMC staff has done with these calculations is to the best of our knowledge and with the data that we have, represent long-term average conditions that we have seen within the basin, both with respect to rainfall as well as the development of the Broderson Mound and other conditions. And that's what's been input as the key assumptions for calculating the sustainable yield. There is acknowledged uncertainty within that, and that is the basis for the 20% buffer that gets incorporated into the basin yield metric calculation and the development of the target basin yield metric of 0.8 and the associated production value that goes along with that. And so the concern is, if you were to put the most conservative assumptions for these key parameters into that initial calculation and then applied a 20% uncertainty, you would find yourself in a very overly conservative situation that wouldn't provide good information for the basis of making management decisions for the basin. And so this is the methodology that was established by the parties during the development of the basin plan, and it is being implemented as required by the stipulated judgment based on the best available information that we have. I will acknowledge, to Keith's point, it is a model, and the sustainable yield estimates are based on a model. But models are the best available tools that we have for predicting future conditions, and they are critical for basin management. Almost every SGMA basin, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act basin in California, has a model. Most of those basins have a transient model, which is a better tool for predicting future conditions. And they use that model to base current management decisions to try to achieve a positive outcome in the future. And so that's what we're doing here. We're using this model to the best of our ability predict future conditions for the basin and make management decisions around that. And then we're observing real-time data to see how well our predictions correlate with what we see in terms of changes in basin groundwater levels or seawater intrusion extents. And we will, as we are doing as part of this sustainable yield estimate, adjust as we get more data and we're able to compare it to model predictions. But I just, from my perspective, models are a critical and essential tool for managing a basin. And as we have in a later item, we have an opportunity to improve the type of model that we have for the basin to improve our future predictions and make better informed management decisions that we will then compare to actual conditions as we move forward. I don't believe the cemetery is using recycled water. I don't know where that was stated. To my knowledge, they're not hooked up. And it's not assumed that they're using recycled water in these sustainable yield scenarios. And then I guess the last one is rainfall. As described at the last meeting, the 17.3 inches is an estimate of rainfall for the Los Osos Basin based off a review of two different methodologies. One, a review of the PRISM isohedral data sets that provide geography-specific anticipated rainfall levels for different portions of the basin, because rainfall does vary even within the basin. And then the other is a correlation with rainfall data from the Morro Bay Fire Station, which is the longest period of record that we have for rainfall data in our coastal area here. And it's correlated to rainfall data from the South Bay Fire Station and the Los Osos landfill to better represent anticipated rainfall in Los Osos. That Morro Bay data set is a longer term data set than some of the more recent trends that were referenced in the public comment. I think nobody's denying that we are in a drought currently and have been in a drought for the last 10, 15 years. We've seen below average rainfall. However, when evaluating rainfall, it's important to, especially when looking at predicting future conditions, to look at a balanced period of rainfall over a longer term average. And that is what is being proposed for the rainfall assumption, and it is what is consistent with how rainfall is evaluated within other basins within California. They look at a long-term period, 30, 40 years over a balanced period of rainfall when assessing potential future rainfall conditions. I think that's all I have in terms of responses.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Okay, let's go to discussion. Who would like to start it off here?
Well, Mr. Chairman, this is Bruce. Let me start by confirming that the cemetery is not taking recycled water, and from the get-go, they had expressed no interest in taking recycled water. So it's really never been on the table, and appreciate Dan's acknowledgement that it's not part of the sustainable yield calculation in this point. And if I could, let me just pick up on his thought about the use of this model. People get hung up, I think, a bit on the fact that we use a model, and a lot of times you hear them call it just a model. But what that is really is the calculation of the available resource based on our best understanding, technical data, and our best understanding of how this physical system works. And as Dan indicated, this is standard practice in managing resources for communities. So there's nothing unusual about the overall approach. We could talk about the epistemic and the aleatoric uncertainty of that model, but that may be a conversation of a different day. But basically, over the course of years, we've developed an understanding of the physical systems here, and we're making estimates of the parameters of the inputs to this model to decide, under a management scenario of using 80% of the safe yield, how much water can be extracted in a sustainable fashion from this basin. We then track that against observations that we make of different physical properties. And I know there's a lot of concern about the nature of the rainfall, a lot of concern about the situation with seawater intrusion. But you'll recall at our last meeting, Dan put forward one of the metrics, an imperfect metric, but a metric nonetheless, that was in fact tracking reasonably well the expectation of the model calculations as regard what is going to happen in the future as the Broderson Mound builds up and as stuff gets, comes to a new equilibrium in the basin. We have an important item coming up that I very much like to get to, which is the moving forward on a better model, the transient model, which I think will help people understand a little bit better, because we're having to use an older style here and make some accommodations to the steady state model to get the information that we need. Basically, I think staff has analyzed this. I think staff has analyzed both the nature of our calculation and the parameters, namely the rainfall going in. There was an extensive discussion of that back in September. And so I'm comfortable with accepting the revised sustainable yield number. Would certainly be supportive of that. I do have two questions and one suggestion here. Dan, in calculating the consequence of a revised sustainable yield based on 50% development at Broderson, the slide showed a line at what 80%, 0.8 basin yield metric would look like, showing it moves offshore. The staff report indicates that current usage against the revised 2380 number produces a basin yield metric of 0.84. And I was just curious, has Spencer, or could Spencer develop and show us where that seawater line would look like for a 0.84 basin yield metric? It should, I would think, retract from, certainly be further seaward than the 100% basin yield metric that was the other one shown.
Yes, Spencer could run a model scenario associated with a basin yield metric of 0.84, and you are correct. I mean, it would anticipate that the seawater intrusion front would be somewhere in between the sustainable yield estimate location and the BYM 80 estimate location, but yes, would shift seaward towards the bay.
Yeah. So the other maybe my next question is really sort of semi a comment as well. If we adopt the revised sustainable yield, we find ourselves at a basin yield metric of 0.84. It would seem to me that the next step would be to talk about some management changes that would get us back to a 0.8 basin or below a 0.8 basin yield metric, given the new revised sustainable yield. Basically, we need to shed about 100 acre feet a year of demand, and I think that would be a useful and an obvious next conversation as to how we reduce demand to get there, or what added infrastructure or operational means could we use to actually provide more of an opportunity for water. And then the last thing is, it seems to me we need a policy about, I think we need a bit more explicit policy about under what circumstances we change the safe yield. I've commented to Dan and possibly to other directors that I think subscripting it with the year suggests that this is a number that is expected to change every year. And indeed it might change, but I think we have to put down in writing and understand and agree to under what circumstances it does change. For instance, one bad year's rainfall does not provide reason to change the safe yield. That's a long-term average. The addition of a specific infrastructure project, on the other hand, very much could, and we hope should, change the safe yield. And so I think we need to be a bit, clear. We need to be very clear and a bit more explicit about under what conditions we're going to change this, because I think we could get ourselves into trouble, at the very least, not have very good management if we're chasing this and making changes to the sustainable yield on less than substantive grounds on a year-by-year basis. So that's a thought, and again, a topic for some future conversation. But bottom line, I'm supportive of the revised number.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. So Charlie or Mark, who wants to go next?
If you don't mind, I'd like to go next for S&T, and I'd like to spread my comments out over a few different methods to let Mark or anybody else make comments in between, so I don't dominate the time here. I'd like to join everyone else thanking the Basin Management Committee staff for this big effort. This isn't a lot of fun to do this as an effort to get us back on the, or not back on, but to put the committee on the rails as defined by the stipulated judgment. And I appreciate the effort and time that it's taken. I suspect that there's been a lot of non-billable hours spent on this. I also am concerned about the 17-inch plus per year rainfall figure, and earlier lodged a formal complaint with Basin staff on this subject and had a couple of meetings about this. I was convinced that I should remove my request to have this agendized at this meeting, as it would be disruptive to the process at hand here. I agreed with that, and I still agree with that. Part of my being convinced was that the 17 plus inches per year rainfall figure, staff argues that is the correct value to place into a steady state model that is used to predict results that occur way out into the future, or as Spencer Harris mentioned a couple of times, out in geological time. That it's not used to, the model is not used to predict things that happen in near year future situations. And so I'll temporarily withhold my protests about this unless I begin to see that we are using these high values for annual rainfall to influence decisions made in the near future. I'd like to ask a question about on PDF page 26 in this item here about the methodology. It's on page 2 of this agenda item. I'd like to ask, what are the new methodologies suggested for estimating the development of the Broderson Mound? And I think right now I'll stop. I have several other questions and comments, but I think I'll stop now to avoid causing confusion.
Do you have a answer to that last question that Charlie had, Dan?
Yeah, so
Rob Broderson?
yeah, I mean, any new methodologies for evaluating Broderson are incorporated into these scenarios. So I guess by new methodologies, it is referencing, I'm not seeing the new methodologies, but the Broderson Mound methodologies were the inclusion of scenarios that didn't just assume 100% development of the Broderson Mound, as had been previously included in all previously completed sustainable yield estimates. And so the new methodologies are the methodologies incorporated into scenarios 3 and 4 that look to simulate sustainable yield with a Broderson Mound that is either 75% developed or 50% developed.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Does anybody want to talk, or do you want to let Charlie to keep going? Mark, what do you want to do?
This is, I'll let Charlie keep going. I'll just make a comment at the end.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, Charlie, you got the floor.
Okay, thank you. I think that S&T is prepared to approve the part of this request which would set the sustainable yield for 2022 at 2,380 acre feet per year. We are not interested in approving an extrajudicial or extra legal process for approving a sustainable yield figure for 2021. That's not allowed by the stipulated judgment agreement. Let's see. I think that's really the end of my comments. I'd like to yield to other people on the committee.
All right, thanks, Charlie. Okay, Mark, floor is yours.
Yeah, my comments are very similar to what we've already heard. I just, want to express my thanks to Dan. I know you've put a lot of effort in your best intent into coming up with the scenarios that are before us. So appreciate the work that you've done working with Spencer and the staff, just really taking a close look at this. I think, kind of jumping into Supervisor Gibson's comments about the model and what it's used for, and forward thinking. It is a model, but we did adapt to the methodology and the findings using the tools and information and best data available. So I think this is a great step for, really, this is the intent of what we should be doing. How frequently we do this, is it on an annual basis or longer, or are there subsequent findings that we have to see before making changes? I would like to dive into that a little bit more and understand that a little better. I haven't really thought through it. I was more focused on what we were doing today, but that is a good comment that we should probably bring back and talk further about. And so, based on the scenarios that I've seen and scenario 4 is in the adaptive methodology. I'm in favor of the 2380 acre feet.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
Sure.
Bruce, do you have anything else to add at this point?
No, sir. I think we've covered it all.
Oh, you know what, Marshall, I'm sorry, I did forget one thing, just the infrastructure. We're going to talk about that. We have additional items, but I agree with Supervisor Gibson, the basic yield metrics, lowering production or the infrastructure improvements, how those are impacted are something that that's additional work we have ahead of us also.
Okay, thank you. Charlie, I had a question for you on something you said I wasn't clear about. You said that, the recommendation here is to adopt this for 2022, not to deal with 2021. But why did you bring up 2021?
That's included in the last paragraph of this proposal. Let me see if I can find. I believe I'm going to go jump in with my PDF.
Oh, here it is.
Yeah, it is the last paragraph on page 8 of this proposal. It is additionally recommended that, comma, and then it talks about using adjustment, some sort of an approval as part of this proposal to approve a process or a number for the 2021 basin yield metric. If I understand that right, that does not agree with the process allowable under the stipulated judgment.
Yeah, well, we need to have clarification from Daniel on that because I didn't know what that meant either.
Yeah, I think we talked about that earlier on in this item. It's not something we need to, or I think even can, or take action on today. It's not a critical near-term item. I think why don't I work with staff to look at the the stipulated judgment and come back with recommendations for it just impacts what is the sustainable yield number that's included in the 2021 annual report. And so we'll come back with recommendations on that, and then obviously a number that gets incorporated into that report.
Can we agree to remove that from the proposal just to simplify this? Would everybody on the committee agree to that?
Sure, it's a non-action today. And when we get to the 21 annual report, if we want to talk about it, we can talk about what kind of language would go in that reflects the conversations we've had today.
Yeah.
Since it says it is additionally recommended that.
Yeah, I agree. Let's just delete that last paragraph. I think that would be fine.
Sounds good.
What do you think, Mark?
Yes, I'm in agreement with that also.
Okay. All right. It sounds like we have a concurrence here, so we'll need to have a motion.
I can make the motion. I'll make a motion to adopt the adaptive methodology specified in scenario 4, which would propose the sustainable yield estimate for calendar year 2022 be set at 2,380 acre feet.
Is there a second?
Dan, is that adequate motion to cover the basis here?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay.
Well, if we don't get a second, it's not going to matter here.
Okay, S&T will second that motion.
Okay, thank you. Any further discussion? Okay, Daniel, why don't you take a roll call vote, please?
Okay. Director Cody,
Yes.
Director Gibson,
Yes.
Director Zimmer,
Yes.
Chairperson Ohilski.
Yes.
Okay, motion passes 4-0.
Okay, great. All right. Let's take a short breath here and then we'll get the shared screen back to Laura. Or
Did
is
you
it-
want to go back to the executive director report number 7?
No, we're going to finish all the way through 8. We probably won't get to 7 today.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so here we are, item 8B, action item, recycled water funding program grant application and county funding request. Daniel, would you like to take it over here?
I would. So we've got a number of additional items on the agenda here today, and I just wanted to add a little preface to these. These are items that I wanted to bring forth to the Basin Management Committee for their consideration for moving forward with in the near term, or we can push them out in time. But part of the motivation for bringing all these items forward is the desire to kind of make additional progress on some of these other initiatives before the end of this calendar year. We have budget that we haven't expended as the BMC, and I think a large part of that is because staff has been focused on the sustainable yield estimate, and that has consumed a lot of our time and kind of slowed our progress in some of these other initiatives. So bringing these other initiatives forth is an intent to get some additional progress done with the budget that we have available for this calendar year. And also to set up some initiatives for inclusion in the calendar year 2022 budget, which this next item will be. But definitely open to input and direction from the BMC into, potentially which of these initiatives the BMC may want to prioritize or deprioritize, just based on the desires of the Basin Management Committee. So, but with that, I'll jump into this one. So as we've discussed, and I'm going to run through these rather quickly, just given the length of time. But happy to answer any questions and provide any additional detail that the BMC may have. But the BMC uses a steady state model currently. However, the county has made available and budgeted for $150,000 for the development of a transient model for the Los Osos Basin. As discussed previously, a transient model is an improved tool that would allow for the better prediction of future basin conditions, as well as help allow evaluating variable climate conditions, climate patterns, and other sort of critical items that have been brought up in the previous items discussion. Additionally, there is a grant funding opportunity through the State Water Resource Control Board's Water Recycling Funding Program that could leverage the $150,000 provided by the county as match funds for an additional $150,000 to not just develop a transient model, but also to be able to utilize that model to run a number of different scenarios for potential future basin conditions and future basin implementation projects to help inform management and infrastructure investments moving forward. And so this item is a request or a recommendation to the BMC to, one, authorize the use of grant pursuit contingency funds included in the calendar year 2021 budget to prepare a water recycling funding application, and two, for the BMC to submit a request to the county to access the $150,000 that the county has budgeted for the development of a transient model. This doesn't commit the BMC to either a grant or the development of a transient model, but does take some of the initial steps to allow the BMC to consider the development of a transient model and or receiving a water recycling funding grant as part of the set of initiatives that the BMC could tackle in 2022. And so that concludes my presentation.
Any questions before we go to public comment? Bruce, I know you had raised something about the transient model in our last discussion.
Yeah, this is something I've been interested in seeing happen for a long time. This is state of the art in terms of managing water basins, and I think it's something we definitely need to do. I was really pleased that our staff, operating as the flood control district, found funding and secured funding for this, and county's happy to contribute because I think it's going to be good for our ability to deal with our challenges here.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's go to public comment then, Laura.
If you'd like to make a public comment, please raise your hand. All right, Jeff, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon again, Jeff Edwards. I find it a little surprising that we're still talking about the funding for the transient model. Clearly, this appears to be superior to the steady state model. And why isn't the county funding the entire model? As far as the math goes, it looks like it's $300,000, of which the flood control district's going to kick in 150. Why doesn't the county fund the whole thing? It's mind-boggling to me that we have to use BMC grant pursuit contingency funding to try to get this grant, measly amount of money. On August 10th, the Board of Supervisors allocated $15 million for water, wastewater, and fiber optic. And the board also earmarked $350,000 to hook up the schools to recycled water. Well, we don't want to hook up the schools. If you're going to do the middle school, that might be a possibility, but the other ones, that's a joke. So let's take some of the $350,000 and complete the funding for the transient model and get on down the road. How tough can this be? Why are we doinking around, taking BMC staff time, trying to beg for another $150K? It's ridiculous. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right, Lindy, you just have to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, Lindy Owen again. I just wanted to bring back, you actually in some of the calculations for recycled water, non-purveyor pumping, the Memorial Park, you have listed that they're getting 50 acre-feet per year. That's why I have brought it up several times. So you need to correct that. If you're not giving them water, then please don't show that you're using that water that way. And I'll come back to what the original idea of this recycled water was to offset the ag pumping that's going on. Now, the question is, when are we going to find out how we could make the ag farmers appreciate getting the water? If you can lower the price to them and save our basin, that is a substantial savings of the water situation that we're in. But as far as I can hear and have watched, that has never been done. You just say they don't want it. Could we find out why they don't want it? And is it too expensive? It's cheaper for them to pump the water out of the ground, our drinking supply out of the ground, than it is for us to work out a deal where we can give them something that's less expensive and possibly cleaner if that's what is needing to be done. That is going to make a huge difference. If you're talking about approximately 30 to 50% of our water going for ag use, come on. So I don't understand, the new studies to see how we can reuse our recycled water. It's not being used intelligently, and it's certainly not the way that it was originally proposed to the CCC, to the Coastal Commission, so that you could get the grant approval. So I think that needs to be added in. And I will agree with Jeff. The county has contributed very little money, especially because all the area that they cover is unmetered wells. And I think it's time for them to step up and cover some of these extra costs. I think that's about all I have to say. Sustainable basin is based on not pumping water out. And if you've got farmers that are pumping half of it out because you can't make a deal with them, how about going back and doing some serious studies about how to convince them to work with us and take that water? And lastly, how much is the dry farmer that we paid to pump pipes up to his property? How much is he taking? I never see him listed. Again, this is abuse of what was supposed to have happened is not happening. And I think that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindy. I would like to remind people that you're supposed to speak about the item that this comment is on, and this was about the grant application, not the use of or the definition of sustainable yield. So in the future, could you still, or please stay on topic for the item? Okay, I'll turn it back over to you, Laura.
All right, Keith, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Keith Weimer. I thought the transient model was supposed to cost about 200,000, and now it's costing close to 300,000. How did that happen? I have to agree with Jeff and Lindy that the grant money, the matching, well, actually the grant money of 150,000 could be spent on actions that would help sustain the basin better. I'm concerned that spending that much money on the model will mean it remains your main tool for decision-making rather than measurable monitoring data. A major shortcoming of the basin plan and BMC operations is over-reliance on the model. A model, no matter how expensive or sophisticated, is a hypothetical construct. It's not reality. And a model is only as good as the data that goes into it, and there are major problems with the monitoring program that need to be fixed. It's critically important for the basin and for the people that rely on it, that BMC decisions become more reality-based, which is to say more data-based and action-oriented. Over-reliance on the model is why you're spending time today adjusting modeling parameters downward after 6 years. With seawater intrusion still advancing, monitoring and metrics in need of significant improvements, the conservation program abandoned, the third program sea well deferred, and purveyors now considering imported water. At this point, you haven't identified a funding source to complete the significant improvements in the monitoring program, to implement the additional conservation, recycled water use and infrastructure programs needed to stop and reverse seawater intrusion, or even to fully implement a basin-wide funding mechanism. You also haven't developed a plan to identify the funds needed to stop nitrate contamination of the lower aquifer wells, or to address the potential threat from forever chemicals. I recommend that you use the 300 or at least the 150 in grant money to develop a funding source and to cover the cost of some of these plans and programs. In the meantime, update the current model and have a peer review done of it, as Cleith Harris recommends in the 2020 annual report. So in response to Dan and to Supervisor Gibson, even Cleith Harris agrees that the model needs to be updated, and we're not using the data appropriately to in the model right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith.
All right, Patrick, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I'd like to agree with Mr. Weimer on the fact that transient models are still hypothetical. And as Dan said, you know, it is something that is being used by pretty much all the other basins around, including the Monterey Basin and the SoCal Basin, which are both in extreme overdraft. So the transient model hasn't really been working for them either. I'd also like to remind everybody that the funding that the county is bringing up is our money. It is our tax money. It isn't just something that all of a sudden is going to appear and the county is going to pay for it just to be good guys. This is our money. And isn't there another way we can use this money to better support our basin? And as Mr. Weimer also says, doing more metering, getting hard data. That is what we need to be doing, and finding out where things really stand. How much water is in the basin, how much seawater is advancing. All those things need hard data, not estimations. So I just want you to be thinking about that also. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.
There was just one written question. It says, why doesn't developers fund this grant? And there's no further public comment at this time.
Thank you. All right, we'll bring it back for discuss. Well, did you have anything you wanted to say, Daniel, in response to the public comment?
No, I mean, I think we've covered the benefits of the model.
Okay. All right, so we'll bring it back for discussion.
I'd be happy to move staff's recommendation.
Yeah, I'd like to just make a comment before responding to that. And the fact is that just, this model is, I agree, once again, theoretical. Would like to have a better understanding of what this model will do for us versus the existing model. We know it's an improvement, but I would like to see what those items are, and what the benefits are. Not right now or this meeting, but as we move forward in developing the model. And one of those reasons is just the reliance on the data coming from the model. Don't want to rely too heavy on it. I think relying on the data is important that we extract from physical water analysis and sampling and those types of physical procedures. So just wanted to make that comment out there. Would Dan, if as we move forward through this process of funding the model and we start to develop the model, have a better understanding of what we expect to achieve from this updated model. In addition, just another question: Is it assumed that Spencer will be the person who consultant putting the transient model together for us? Is that something we can assume at this point right now?
Yeah, I guess 2 points. First point, yeah, we can expand upon the differences and the benefits of a transient model versus a steady state model, at future meetings when we get to the actual decision point for initiating that project. Two, with regards to who developed that model, I'd look to guidance from the Basin Management Committee in terms of how they would want to procure and select a consultant for developing a groundwater model of that type. Spencer obviously, I think, has the most knowledge of the basin and is a very critical component of BMC staff in terms of our understanding. But for a project like that, it may make sense or be prudent to solicit other proposals. The other component there was a comment, I'll just respond to it now, is that the cost of the model going up. The core cost of the model is around $200,000. There are other components that we've included in the anticipated budget. One of them is an inclusion of a peer review from a sort of third-party hydrogeologist. We think there's a lot of value in that, in having another trained set of eyes throughout the full model development, calibration, and utilization process. So that's part of the cost. And then there are other costs just associated with getting the grant. The grant is, in essence, free money, though nothing's free. There are strings attached. You need to produce a final report for the grant. There's some grant administrative components. And so those are the other things that are included in the increase from $200,000 to $300,000 roughly.
Thank you, Daniel. Excuse me. Charlie, you got any comments?
Yes, I think I agree with earlier statements that I like this proposal, and S&T will vote to approve this proposal. But I think we need to, a couple of things. We still need to maintain the existing steady state model, and I'm interested in having a peer review, which is due for that by a larger team, I think, to assist the basin staff on that project. I think also I agree with what Director Zimmer suggests is I'd like to see a larger group of experts on a team developing this new model. And I look forward to that. And I think I would expect that basin staff does not try to insulate members of this committee at public meetings from details regarding the development of a new model and the details that exist that will be used to build that. There are a few members on this committee who have extensive experience in complicated systems modeling, and I don't think that we should be isolated from the details. And those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right. We had a motion from Bruce, I believe. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, we need a second.
I'll second the motion. Mark.
Okay. All right. Can you take a roll call, Daniel, please?
Sorry, I caught myself on mute. Director Cody,
Yes.
Director Gibson,
Yes.
Director Zimmer,
Yes.
Chair Ohilsky.
Yes.
Okay, motion passes.
Oh. Okay, so that we move on then to item 8C, BMC funding options consulting services. Okay, Daniel.
Yes, thank you, Marshall. It was envisioned in the stipulated judgment that a more formal funding mechanism, zone of benefit, for example, would be established to fund administrative or monitoring and management activities for the BMC. However, to date, there has not been a formal funding mechanism established, and the BMC is funded through contributions of each of the parties. Recently, BMC staff and party staff formed a funding and organizational subcommittee to discuss and evaluate potential options. As part of that process, we developed some preliminary or proposed goals for that outcome, which include allocating costs equitably to those who benefit from the basin's water resource. This is consistent with a goal from the basin plan. Also developing strategies to maximize grant and other funding financing opportunities for basin plan implementation. Again, that's consistent with the basin plan. Funding mechanism to enable joint or individual purveyor ownership of basin infrastructure, and then equitable cost sharing amongst all current basin users, purveyors, individual well owners, and new development. The funding and organizational subcommittee developed a summary of the different funding options available for the BMC based on our collective knowledge, information from the TASIG report, and then also identified some benefits and constraints. One of the key outcomes of this is that the funding and organizational subcommittee and or BMC staff really identified that it would be beneficial to bring in an outside consultant to review the previous work that the BMC had done on funding options and prepare an updated evaluation of the different options available to the BMC. And it would be beneficial for a number of reasons. The first reason is that the BMC and BMC party staff are not experts in this arena. This is a somewhat fairly specialized arena focused on funding and financing for public utilities. And so we didn't necessarily feel that we had all the latest and greatest information on the different funding options and constraints and requirements associated with them Two, there have been changes described in the different funding mechanisms available since 2015 when the last funding study was done. Three, the TOSIC report, and through no fault of its own, didn't include evaluation of an AB 1600 funding mechanism or development impact fee funding mechanism, because at the time, as stated in the report, the community plan wasn't progressed sufficiently to warrant looking at development impact fees as a potential funding mechanism. And then for the proposal included in this staff report from SCI would go beyond just looking at different mechanisms and would start to look at the potential fee impact of a different magnitude of a different funding mechanism, or the magnitude of that fee impact, by calculating, the amount of funds that would need to be raised, and then attributing that over, a number of different metrics, number of parcels, number of well owners, number of other potential funding contributors within the basin, which represents work that has not been done to date, and very informative work for helping the BMC and the parties decide, how to move forward with the establishment of a more formal funding mechanism for the basin. And then the fifth reason that BMC staff recommended this is just to bring some additional horsepower to this initiative to allow it to move forward in a more expedited manner. There are a number of specific initiatives that the BMC staff is focused on that require BMC staff input. And this is really one where you can leverage outside consultants to significantly advance an initiative in a short amount of time, using funds that have been previously approved by the BMC. So with all that, included in the staff report is a proposal from SCI Consultants. It's recommended that the BMC approve that proposal to allow SCI to complete the described scope of work between now and the end of the year. And there is sufficient budget available in the calendar year 2021 budget for that. That concludes my presentation.
Okay, thank you. So is there any questions before we go to public comment? I have one question then. How did you come up with SCI?
Yeah, so I was actually at a Groundwater Resources Association conference, and I saw a presentation from SCI staff related to funding evaluation and polling work that they had been doing in other groundwater basins throughout California. And I was impressed by the work that they were doing and the knowledge that they had in that arena, and had solicited, I had a conversation with them to explain some of the challenges that we have here in Los Osos, and through that conversation solicited a proposal from them for the described work.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions before we go to public comment? Okay, Laura.
If you'd like to make a public comment, please raise your hand. All right, Keith, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I just want to compliment the committee, and I guess Dan's the representative of the committee there, on their efforts. This information provides a clear overview, wide range of options, and it looks like SCI does have a very strong resume. What I don't see in the scope of work, however, is an opportunity for the public to hear directly from the consultant during the process or after the process, and to provide input into the process before the funding option TM is finalized. So will the public be included in one or more BMC meetings with the consultant? I recommend at least one meeting includes the public. Also, please tell us how the public can provide input into the process early on, so the consultant sees and considers public input in the development of the TM. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith.
All right, Jeff, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Jeff Edwards. And, the governance and funding question has been on the table since the BMC was formed. And so that's 5 years. And now within the matter of 1 month, because Heimel went to a seminar, we now have a proposal on the table that they're asking you to approve. This isn't how you contract for consultants. You don't sole source based on a seminar. It's just not how government works. And you're a quasi-government agency or entity. You know, there's an expression, you've heard it, keep it simple, stupid, the KISS principle. Well, that's exactly what we're doing here, or not doing here, I should say. We're hiring another consultant. By the way, since we've skipped the executive director report, we didn't get to comment on the lawyer. Now the BMC needs its own lawyer. It needs its own governance and funding consultant. I'm shocked and dismayed. This is absolute insanity. This funding subcommittee, who's on the committee? And they should know that this isn't, you don't sole source these kinds of contracts. And, you know, the idea there, I think the contract's 18.5 or the proposal's 18.5. They're just getting their foot in the door. This will lead to another contract and another contract after that. This will be in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars by the time we're done. And the only thing they're adding that we haven't already looked at in the Taussig study is this question of county resource impact fee, which, by the way, the county has hired a consultant, MKN, to do a similar analysis for wastewater impact fees. So if vacant properties are going to connect to the sewer, they need to pay a fee. Well, this work's already being done by the county, or analogous work, I should say. And the AB 1600, it's all part of the same picture. New development impact fees. New development should pay its way, but we don't need this SCI to do this. We just don't need to do it. Just like we don't need a lawyer for the BMC. This is becoming a bureaucratic quagmire, and Heimel and WSC are principally behind this. They'll end up handing off all the work to sub-consultants and simply do traffic directing at the end of the day. So I'm against this. Don't do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
There's no further public comment at this time.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, I'll bring it back for discussion and maybe a motion.
Yeah, I'll make a comment. You know, really, this funding options and mechanism is the core of our basin plan and really was the roadmap to how we were going to complete basin plan projects. So what we've done to date, I mean, it has been on our discussion and topic since, you know, the BMC began. And our last consultant may not have provided us the information in the manner needed, but the walkaway was, I think we all agreed, you know, it was going to be expensive to implement an initiative for basin-wide funding, and the likelihood of it succeeding was not very positive. So I do think we need to work to solidify and flesh this out and come to a determination. And, you know, if there is a product where the consultant needs to come before the BMC, that I would support that. But ultimately, the product I would like to know is if it isn't going to be successful, or there aren't items that we can easily grab onto where we feel there will be a success, you know, we need to understand that we're going to have to come to a determination on the basin plan of what can we implement among the purveyors in the county, and what is simply not going to get done, and make adjustments accordingly. Because the basis of the basin, I mean, the foundation of the basin plan projects we're going to be funded through a basin-wide assessment. So I think, another walk away would be, understand the pulse of the community. Is there an opportunity to do a survey, hearing comments and not receiving very many right now I don't have a good understanding of that. So maybe one of our next steps is we really dive out there and try to get understand the pulse of the community of whether this type of initiative would be accepted or not. For what we're doing today, I support the staff's recommendation to look at this, because we do need to flush it out and come to a consensus. But moving forward, we're going to have to make some decisions, and it will be on, we'll have to address it in future BMC meetings. That's it.
Thank you, Mark.
Mr. Chairman, it's Bruce. I endorse everything Mark said. I guess, Dan, could you, well, first of all, looking at the resume of SCI, they seem eminently qualified. Dan, could you speak to the question of sole sourcing and against which either policies or statutes you're recommending doing this?
Yeah, it's a good question, Director Gibson, and it's one that has come up at a staff level recently. To my knowledge, the BMC doesn't have a procurement policy similar to how a government agency would have, the county, the CSD. And so we don't have specific guidance in terms of how and at what thresholds competitive selection needs to occur, for obtaining BMC consulting and other services. And so it's something that we've talked about at staff level, and I'd be interested to get guidance from the BMC on this. Would they like to see something brought forth that we can use as a framework for selecting services moving forward? I would say again, part of the goal with this and some of these other initiatives is that we have budget available this year. If we can spend it before the end of the year, it doesn't need to come out of the budget for next year, and we can tackle other initiatives. And, because of the nature of the BMC and the way it's funded, it's essentially that budget does not roll over. And so that's part of the urgency here, but it's understandable that, I want to make sure that the BMC is comfortable with, what other consultants are being brought on, that it was done in a fair and equitable manner. And, we can make do, but it's not, necessarily critical that this happen now, though I think it would be advantageous in allowing the BMC to make progress on this critical initiative.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying, and we're not constrained by specific state statute in our contracting requirements at this point?
Not to my knowledge, no. I mean, yeah. Okay.
I think having some at least general policy, because we've done it a couple of different ways. I think we do have previous contracts that we have let on sole source. Again, I think this particular contractor is eminently qualified, but it might be good to have a little something written down at a point. But I can support what's before us today.
Yeah, I agree with Bruce. I think we do need to have a policy on sole sourcing, because I think that there's some places where it may be desirable to use somebody that we've worked with in the past, like Spencer Harris, but in other sources, it may be, or in other cases, it may be better to go out with the RFP and not sole source it. So
I think we've chosen that pretty carefully. That we did do a request for proposals on, in fact, the executive director, for instance. But
right. And I just think we need to have a policy rather than just
this specialized piece of information. I'm comfortable doing this.
Okay, so what do you guys want to do?
This is Charlie from S&T. I also have some concerns, not so much about sole sourcing this, but I think it's a little bit, the advice we've already gotten indicates that we should form a joint powers authority in order to maximize our funding opportunities. And as far as contracting goes, because we don't have an entity here in basin management that can have a bank account and so on, we are finding ourselves having people contract to the legal and accounting firm on retainer by Golden State Water, because we can't write checks at the Basin Management Committee. We're lacking the fundamental starter of how we could operate as a professional kind of an entity. So I think that probably I agree with what Director Zimmer and Director Gibson have said. And to just expand a little bit on Director Zimmer's comments, I wonder if the advice, the primary advice we get from a consultant will be, you need to form some type of an entity that can have a bank account before you can manage funds to manage monies that come in. And so I wonder if maybe we should table this. I would vote to do this because we have funds on hand for doing this, but I think we've already been down this road, as Director Zimmer said. And I think that maybe first we could focus on forming a joint powers authority before we begin.
Yeah, Charlie, as you probably know, your predecessor, Bill Garfield, was on the committee, but we did go through an entire JPA process. And correct me if I'm wrong, Bruce, wasn't the cost of that analysis like $250,000?
No, I don't remember that it was that much, Marshall. I think, you know, that what we got was a pro-con analysis, and there was some upfront costs. I want to say it was more like $50,000, but that's just a vague memory. Don't hold me to
I think
it.
we'd have to, we'll have to go back and look at that, because I
we
don't
have
remember.
Yeah, we have the pro-con on that, and I'm certainly open to that conversation.
Yeah, we can agendize that for discussion at a future meeting, Charlie. But we'll have to pull up all those past records on that, because I know we went through a probably half a year process to do that. And then at the end, it was decided not to go down that route.
Yeah, this is Mark. We did go down that route. Right now, I don't, we have a funding mechanism in place, and it's our contributions. What we've been doing has been working. Forming a JPA is going to further complicate things. And I just think that this instance right now is not the reason to initiate a JPA. So I think we've already been down that path for right now, unless something substantial comes before us for that need. I don't know why we'd go through that again.
Well, Charlie, I'll put together what happened and when we went through down that the first time and send that to you, so you have that as background information. How's that?
Thank you, Director Shusky. I appreciate that.
Okay.
If I might contribute here, and I wasn't involved in the JPA discussions that happened at the BMC previously, but from my perspective, I think funding and organization are in some ways two separate initiatives, and so really the formation of a JPA, based on my understanding, doesn't generate a new funding mechanism other than if there's a more defined contributions from the existing parties. This organization or funding study looks at what are all the other funding mechanisms outside of contributions from the existing BMC parties that could potentially be available to fund the BMC, whether or not it becomes a JPOA or some sort of other organization.
Yeah. So I think that makes
Yeah.
sense.
And I agree with that. You know, if we were going to achieve a community-wide funding mechanism, then a JPA would make sense. But as of right now, I don't think we've reached a level where a JPA makes sense. You know, we're not there. So I think that's one of the determinations of this community assessment and funding opportunities is would we move into forming a JPA at that point?
I'm not as clear. This is Cody again with S&T. I'm not as clear that the organization can be separated as easily from funding. And I wonder, for instance, if Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, and Schreck, the people who are currently doing our bookkeeping and payroll, who are on retainer by Golden State Water, if they would be prepared to do more banking, expanded banking, for instance, holding money in escrow and that type of thing for us. I guess they're sort of doing that now. I just, anyway, you know my opinion.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I'll put together the information about why we decided to not go down that road before, and then you can take a look at it and then make a more educated, decision.
Mr. Chairman, this is Bruce. I wonder if we can get this item concluded here. I just got reminded that I have a 3:30 meeting that I'm supposed to be in. I see my alternate has actually been promoted as a panelist, and I'll just check that she's ready to take over. But if we could deal with this and get a decision, I would ask to be excused at that point.
This is Charlie, and I'll make a motion that we accept this recommendation.
I'll second.
I'm sorry, Bruce, you seconded?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, want to take a vote here, Dan, please?
Okay, Director Cody,
Yes.
Director Gibson,
Yes.
Director Zimmer,
Yes.
Chair Ohilski.
Yes.
Okay.
And Bruce, before you leave, I think that what the goal is here is to finish through the action items and then just basically defer the executive director's report until our next meeting, since there's nothing pressing on that. So you'll have opportunity to learn about all those things and be in on the discussion on those.
I appreciate that. And I have discussed those issues with our public works staff, and I myself am supportive. I think staff is supportive of the next couple items. I'll let Kate weigh in and cast the vote for the county and thank her in advance for being here. And we'll see you next time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Marshall Biden.
Thanks, Bruce.
All right.
Bye, guys.
All right, welcome, Kate.
Thanks.
All right, let's move on then. So item 8D is the Wellhead survey authorization. So Daniel, would you like to move forward on this one, please? You there, Daniel? You're muted.
Thank you.
There you go.
That's two. All right. Hopefully I don't get a third. In 2020, the BMC funded a wellhead survey to collect more accurate elevation data for wells within the Los Osos Basin, where previously available elevation data was only available from topographic maps. What's proposed on this item is to do an additional survey to collect more accurate wellhead elevation data from a number of other wells to improve the data and specifically the water level data that we collect from those wells to better inform our understanding of water levels within the basin, the development of groundwater level contours, and our ability to manage the basin. And so there's included a table of the wells. The request is only for the BMC to fund the group of 19 wells. But the county staff has indicated that they would be interested in surveying the other 12, or I believe 11 wells that are part of their monitoring program. And so included in here is costs for Twin City survey of $5,100, and Cleith Harris Geologist is $2,500 to perform this wellhead survey. And then the additional request is to submit a request to the county that they survey the wells within their program.
Thank you, Daniel. We have any questions before we go to public comment? Okay, Laura.
If you'd like to make a public comment, please raise your hand. All right, Keith, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, I just had a question, a couple questions mainly. And thanks, Dan, for bringing this item forward. All I want to suggest is that the surveys might also be needed for LA1 and LA3. In 2016 annual report, a footnote indicates that these wells were resurveyed at some point, but later the county adjusted the elevation reference point after raising the wellhead. So they may require another survey. Also, I'm just wondering, is the county going to hire somebody to do these surveys? I mean, there's supposed to be a licensed surveyor. They probably have a licensed surveyor on staff, but you know, it would feel a little bit better if these surveys were being done by somebody, more of an outside objective observer, I'd say. I don't know how else to put it. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith.
There's no further public comment at this time.
Okay, we'll bring it back for discussion.
Sorry, this is Mark. I just have one question. Is this the last phase? Are we expected to see more phases, or is this going to complete the wellhead survey needs moving forward?
I believe this is the anticipated completion of the phases for wellhead survey at this point. The wells that are included in this phase are wells that, my understanding, we do not have good survey or accurate elevation data for, and also wells that are screened in dedicated zones such that they provide valuable information for developing the contours for the different portions of the aquifer. There are other wells out there, other wells that I believe that are part of the monitoring program, but my understanding is that those wells are screened in multiple zones. They're not providing definitive information for specific portions of the aquifer, and so we're not included in this list of wells. So, but it's a long way of saying, I think this is the completion of the wells that we feel warrant survey within the basin.
Yeah, this is Kate here. Just speaking from the county's perspective, yes, we're willing and able to survey those wells. And the wells will be surveyed by a licensed surveyor within the Public Works Department.
Thank you, Kate.
And then, if you don't mind, Terrell Hilsky, there was a question around LA1 and LA3, and I may not have the full answer. Maybe I can connect with Keith afterwards, but my understanding, if those wells were previously surveyed and have an accurate reference point elevation, even if they're raised, and you can still collect an accurate measurement of the distance between the previous survey reference point and the raised reference survey point, and still get quality data. But I can double back with Spencer Harris on that just to confirm.
Okay, thank you. Okay, what do you all want to do here?
This is Cody at S&T, and I will move to accept this wellhead survey authorization proposal or the recommendation.
I'll second that.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Okay, Daniel, take a vote, please.
Director Cody,
Yes.
Director Ballantyne,
Yes.
Director Zimmer,
Yes.
Chair Ohilsky.
Yes.
Okay, motion passes.
Okay, that brings us up to the last item, 8E, the lower aquifer monitoring evaluation.
Yes, so item 8E, lower aquifer monitoring evaluation. As this group knows, zone D is the deepest portion of the aquifer, most susceptible to seawater intrusion. In the 2020 annual report, Cleith Harris geologist identified 4 locations where existing wells might be potentially modified to provide better data on zone E water quality to help us better understand the movement of the seawater intrusion front within zone E. And so this is a proposal for Cleith Harris geologists to do that evaluation of what would be required to modify those wells to improve our monitoring network for zone E in the lower portion of the aquifer, as well as provide recommendations for an additional site for a new dedicated lower aquifer monitoring well that would allow us to monitor both zones D and E. The primary intent of this is to provide the BMC with improved information for how it could best and most cost effectively improve its monitoring network for seawater intrusion and help inform future initiatives to improve that monitoring network. And so there's an estimated cost of $7,000 for Cleith Harris geologists to do this evaluation and bring these recommendations back to the Basin Management Committee. And we do have sufficient contingency funds available to cover that at this point.
Thank you, Daniel.
I have this is Charlie at S&T, and if I'm allowed, I'd like to ask staff a question.
Sure, you're allowed.
So I went back to the reference 2020 annual report on PDF page 61, where this recommendation was made, and the specific wells are called out. And none of these wells are S&T mutual water wells. So we don't have any kind of operational problem with that. But I wonder if the individual purveyors who do operate these wells agree to have their wells modified.
Well, and I guess so this is just a proposal to evaluate potentially modifying those wells. And so no actual physical changes would be made until the results from this evaluation would be brought back to the BMC so they could consider whether they would want to invest in those physical modifications to existing wells, or would they be better suited investing in a new dedicated monitoring well. So I guess I don't know how the other purveyors would respond to that, but I guess there wouldn't be committing to any physical modifications to their wells through approval of this item.
No, it just provides additional information and data is my take on that. I don't know, Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I guess I'm unclear on what those modifications would be and would it impact what those impacts would be, but evaluating whether these are good monitoring wells, and or if another dedicated well is needed, when there's a substantial cost savings between drilling a new well and using an existing well. So I would support this initiative here based on that direction, but determining the outcome, and we'll definitely look at what those impacts are to operating wells.
Okay, so what do you guys want to do here?
Probably need to go to public comment.
Oh, yes, sorry. I'm sorry. It's been a long meeting, as you can tell. Yeah, let's go to public comment on item 8E.
If you'd like to make a public comment, please raise your hand. All right, Keith, you just have to unmute yourself.
I spoke on every other one. I thought I'd try this one too. No, I'm not just trying to waste time. I want to thank Dan for bringing this forward. This, I think, is a very important item. The lack of adequate monitoring for the deep aquifer is really a glaring problem with the monitoring program. I may be hearing it wrong, but every time Dan introduces this item, he's talking. You use the singular for the other wells that might be considered, Dan. And I know it's going to take several wells in addition to possibly the ones that are modified to do an adequate job. And I'm glad to see that in this discussion, they are, I believe Cleith Harris is talking about identifying possible sites for a number of wells. And so I think the only thing I just want to emphasize that you can't create more dedicated Zone E wells without out of mixed aquifer Zone D and E wells unless you're eliminating the Zone D aspect of those wells. So you're going to have to put, adequate, new wells in. And new wells, especially like the new nested site, at Lupine, is going to be, they're going to be a much better alternative if we can go that way, because you have these, obviously new wells that are getting really, accurate data, and they're doing it right at the same site, which is a good way to compare what's happening in Zone D and E. But please don't skimp on this. Do a good job, and when it comes forward, the proposals come forward, I hope that Cleith Harris, is not skimping on the number of wells, anticipating that there's going to be a concern about cost, because this is extremely important to find out what goes on in Zone D and E, and especially Zone E, because we don't even know now. So I'd like just one more question, Dan, could you tell us how this dovetails and works with the metric evaluation that will be coming up? And will that metric evaluation include, as you suggested at one point, a possible development of measurable objectives that would be, keyed to the chloride and water level metrics? That's it.
Okay, thank you, Keith.
There's no other public comment at this time.
All right, we'll close public comment and bring it back to Daniel.
Yeah, in response to the question about how this would dovetail to the new chloride metric or updated metrics. If approved today, this evaluation potentially, I need to, would check with Spencer Harris, but he probably has a good idea, could be done in parallel with the recommendations for updating the chloride metric. If we are going to get, envision new modifications to existing wells that would provide us more reliable data on the movement of the seawater intrusion front in Zone E, then potentially those could be incorporated into the chloride metric. So I think there is an opportunity for these to interface. And then, additionally, I think if the recommendation is a new dedicated monitoring well or wells, that would definitely play into I would assume we would target those new wells or even these modified wells in areas where they could contribute to the metrics that we use for monitoring the health of the basin.
Okay, thank you. Any more discussion or a motion?
It's Kate here. I'll just move staff's recommendation.
Okay, thank you, Kate.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, Mark. All right, last vote for today. Let's go.
All right. Director Cody,
Yes.
Director Ballantyne,
Yes.
Director Zimmer,
Yes.
Chair Olhilsky.
Yes.
Okay, motion passes.
Okay, so we're going to continue the executive director's report till next meeting since there was nothing on there that was really pending, and this has been a long, very, very productive meeting. But under the Brown Act, I do need to take public comment on agenda item 7, the executive director's report. So if anybody has public comment on that, Laura?
If you'd like to make public comment on the executive director report, please raise your hand. All right, Patrick, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I'd like to talk about, in the executive director's report, we're talking about the ADUs and stuff, and I'd like to talk about ADUs versus guest houses. This is now what seems to be happening regarding new ADUs. There's a project that recently came to the county for a new ADU in Los Osos. According to the contractor, he was told by the county that ADUs are not being allowed in the coastal zone any longer, but he could change his plans to a guest house, which the county will approve. Now, the only difference between an ADU and a guest house is a guest house cannot be rented, and only the residents that are living in the main house can occupy it. Unfortunately, the county has no oversight with this. They cannot go knocking on the door and ask if the guest house is being rented or inquire who's living in it. So actually, a guest house could easily become an ADU. This is the loophole the county is using to increase occupancy, which increases water demand. A guest house still needs to offset their water use by using the county's offset program, but the county is using the old metrics for the offset program, and they have been shown not to save water, but to actually use more water. My question for the purveyors is, why haven't you pushed back on the county by asking them not to issue or process new development until Title 19 has been updated? The county doesn't even have their consultant yet. So they're still using the old metrics, and who knows how long that could continue on. And then any water saving plans it incorporates, that is the new Title 19, should be used to save water for the basin and not for development until there's conclusive evidence the basin is sustainable. Therefore, no further water demanding development should be approved. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Keith, you just have to unmute yourself.
Real quickly, yeah, I just want to echo what Patrick had to say, that the sustainability group opposes the use of the Title 19 program until the county shows with conclusive evidence that the basin can support new development. And we think the BMC should oppose it because it undermines a BMC conservation program, which is supposed to reduce seawater intrusion. The county program is designed only to not make it worse. Since there is only so much conservation potential remaining in the basin, it should be maximized to reduce seawater intrusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith.
All right, Lindy, you just have to unmute yourself.
Hi again, Lindy Owen. And I'm going to follow up on Keith and Patrick's comments. You do not repair and save a basin by putting more users on it. I think that's pretty simple logic. throughout the state of California, the red flags are flying. This entire state is suffering from the drought. The reservoirs are empty. The rivers are empty. Salmon are dying off. This is not yesterday or 20 years ago. This is the future that we're looking at. I don't know why there is not more sense of caution. I think it's only the community of Los Osos, and even our purveyors are concerned about issuing more growth permits and allowing more water usage in the county. I think that it's up to the county to come to terms with our needs, not their needs. Every house that gets built brings in additional income and revenue to them. Apparently, that revenue does not even give us enough funds to take care of our park and some of the other infrastructure issues in the county or along the coastal area. I don't see, again, just ask yourselves how putting more users on a basin is going to help it. And so we ask that you go forward with a lot of direction. I think it's time for a building moratorium until we can actually see that there is a sustainable supply and we don't have to start talking about importing outside water. That outside water, and if you want to see how much it's going to cost for new development to pay their way, go ahead and calculate the cost of that imported water and then come back and see if they're interested in trying to build here. I don't think they will. Currently, the county is not being very honest with people. When they buy an empty lot, they're being given some sense that in the near future they can build. And that is not correct. So I'd like the county to be our friend and work with us. And I hope we can see that in the direction they take in the future. Thank you.
There's no other public comment at this time.
Okay, thank you. With that, we'll close public comment. And I'd like to thank everybody for their participation today, and then we'll go ahead and adjourn.